All right. So I think we're good to begin. Are we good back there, Jason? All right. So hello and welcome to our first in-person Lunchtime Looks of 2022 and our first fully in-person, as in not hybrid Lunchtime Looks, since March of 2020. Yay. So as you might have noticed, we're still recording this event, even though we don't have a live audience, and will be available on the Art Museum of WVU's YouTube playlist, thanks to the help of my colleague Andrea, and access through our website. We are so excited to have people here with us in person and get to look at these works of art together. And to lead us in this close looking, I am honored to welcome today's speaker, Kelly Watson. Dr. Watson is a service assistant professor and assistant director of Women's and Gender Studies, where she oversees the undergraduate program and supervises the department's graduate assistants. As a scholar, Dr. Watson's research explores the intersections of gender and sexuality, colonialism, and indigeneity in the early modern Atlantic world. It is through this lens that she is going to explore the prints in our Femfolio exhibition today, and I'm thrilled to turn it over to her to do so.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for coming. Welcome. I'm happy to be here. So I just want to first talk a little bit about how I felt about doing this and how I approached it and why I'm here. So when Heather first asked me to do this, I think in August, I reluctantly agreed. And the closer it got to today, the more nervous I became. I talk in front of audiences all the time, and I'm not typically terribly nervous. But so I sat with myself and asked why it is that this made me so nervous and uncomfortable. And it comes down to things that I'm not really used to talking about, and namely that's art. So my friends and family can attest to the fact that I am not a connoisseur of visual arts, and I feel inadequate at art museums, and I struggle to interpret works of art, or I think I do, perhaps is more accurate, and I have to rely on my dear, long-suffering partner, who's right there, and I'm going to point to him right now, Jason, to help me out, right? He's been to many museums with me where I just say things like, but it's blue, I don't understand. And then he tells me why that blue thing means something, and then I feel inadequate. But Heather's assured me that I'm not here to talk as an expert or an art critic or an art historian, but those feelings of inadequacy still remained. And so I had a few reflections, I think, on that discomfort. First and foremost, I'm most comfortable talking about things from the distant past. Discussing works of art with artists who are alive makes me a little nervous, right? I'm a historian, and I typically talk about things with people who are long since dead. So it just feels like the stakes are different. But those feelings of inadequacy, I think, are actually quite crucial to thinking about feminist art. You can come sit, you're fine. Quite crucial to thinking about feminist art. That women's art has long been relegated to the realm of handicrafts. They were seen as artisans, not artists. Women have always made beautiful, provocative, thought-provoking work, but their works were never afforded the same attention as men's. Women's art was perceived as possessing less depth and substance than the work of their male counterparts. And to put it simply, women artists in the West have always had a difficult time being taken seriously. So my own feelings about art are a reflection of this. I doubt my expertise. I cannot imagine that anyone would think I have anything insightful to say. And most importantly, I assume that my voice isn't needed. But my voice has been swallowed up by those feelings of inadequacy and anxiety. And that's what makes the feminist art movement and feminist art so important. That these women used their voices in a time and place where they were told they had no right or ability to speak. It may not feel like a radical act of bravery from our 21st century perch, but it was, and it still is. Some of these pieces speak in a loud voice. They speak with anger. Right? There was an intentionality of where I'm standing here. They speak with anger, which women are trained to suppress. To be an angry woman is to risk not being taken seriously. But to be a tranquil woman is to risk the same thing. So while gender is clearly an element of many of these pieces, I was actually quite surprised when I first walked through the exhibit by how understated that was. Is the feminism of these artists obvious to you? Right? If you didn't know that this was a collection of feminist artists, would that immediately be what you think? Does art need to be about feminism or patriarchy or power to be feminist? Does it need to be created by a person who claims to be feminist? But don't worry, I'm not going to answer those questions, and I'm just going to leave them there and we can talk about it later. So, in addition to Heather's wonderful introduction, I wanted to provide a little context about how I am coming to this art and where I'm approaching it. So every degree I have is interdisciplinary. So for an interdisciplinary speaker about art, it makes some sense. My undergraduate majors were American Studies and Ancient History, and my PhD is in American Studies. So I'm really comfortable thinking outside of the confines of a specific field. And before coming to WVU as a tenured professor of history at a small liberal arts college in Kansas City, and just this is my plug for if you've never been to Kansas City and visited their museums, you should, because they have great art scene and really great museums. And prior to the project I'm working on right now, which I can talk a little bit more about later, most of my work is early modern Atlantic world, so North America, 1400 to 1800. My dissertation, which became my first book, examined the ways that European empires lodged accusations of cannibalism against indigenous peoples in the Americas in order to justify their conquest and colonization. Last year, I finished a project about the role of indigenous women as what I called sexual diplomats in 17th century Maryland. So to make a long story short, my work examines the impacts of colonialism on indigenous peoples through the lens of gender. I'm interested in the ways that European conquerors reacted to gendered practices that differed from their own. Most often they reacted with horror, but also with thinly veiled fascination. They claimed that indigenous peoples, there's going to be some air quotes, weren't doing gender right, and that was proof enough of their savagery and thus justification enough for conquest. One of my favorite quotes, this just kind of summarizes all the things that I'm doing. One of my favorite quotes comes, there should be air quotes, favorite quotes comes from a man whose name was known only in history as the Anonymous Conqueror. He was a contemporary of Cortez and participated in the conquest of Tenochtitlan. And this is what he had to say about gender. And he was speaking about the Aztec and the Aztec Empire, and he remarked that, quote, "There are no people in the world who hold their women in less esteem, for they never tell them what to do, even though they should know that by doing so, they would be greatly benefited." Right? So I can talk more about that quote some other time, but I think it's very funny and sad. So at the same time that European men desired the bodies of indigenous people for more than just their productive labor or power, indigenous women were assumed to possess an insatiable desire to copulate with European men. European writers about indigenous peoples in the Americas love to talk about how lascivious and promiscuous they were and denigrate them for that at the same time that sexual assault and sexual violence were rampant. So I'd be happy to talk more about this research and my current project during a Q&A. My current project is actually 20th century, so all the things I just said aren't true. It's actually about 20th century, some people who are still alive, but it's still about the process of empire and gender and sexuality, and I'm looking at a 20th century scientist who won the Nobel Prize in 1976 in physiology or medicine for his work in Papua New Guinea on prion disorders, which are like mad cow disease. But at the same time that he was doing that research, he also adopted/acquired more than sort of 35 to 50 children that he brought to the United States, and then in 1996 he was convicted of sexual molestation of one of those children. So you can see how those threads might tie together, but I don't know that you want to hear all the gory details about that right now. So the two pieces behind me, I guess to the sides of me, are the ones that I was most struck by when I visited the exhibit, so those are the two that I'm going to focus on today. So when I look at these two, I see very literal interpretations of colonialism. I wanted to learn more about why they were created and who created them and when, and I could find out more about the artists, but I actually couldn't, without doing a lot more work than I had time to do, figure out exactly when they were created and necessarily sort of how each artist relates to colonialism, this experience of colonization. So, not knowing much about how these works necessarily fit in with the larger oeuvre of each artist, I see some similarities. So the first thing that might strike both of you, right, might strike you about both these is that they each have maps, right? And maps are vehicles for meaning making in ways that we might not always think about. They help us orient ourselves in relation to the larger world. For Europeans in the American conquest, they were also tools of empire, right? They were created to demonstrate the limits of claims of power, right? You need to look no further than the exciting 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, in which the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal and the spheres of influence. And this map is quite literally a space of the negotiation of power. There are some really stunning examples of pre-Columbian maps made by indigenous peoples which actually interpret space in a very different way. And maps don't have to look in the way that we imagine them. And they can really explain stories of how people came to be, how they came to be in a space, how they relate to the natural world, or they can be tools of dividing up space into kind of manageable entities. They can also remove that human layer altogether and be maps of the land. So the map, this is the island of Maui. It's a topographical map. The map of Texas over here, so you might not be able to see that, but it's a map of Texas, was created by the US State Department, which it says there in the bottom right. And this kind of map made by the government is not meant to show how people live or demonstrate the beauty of the landscape. It's meant to show political and economic boundaries. Who controls which spaces and what geographic features might get in their way. Layered on top of this image is this beautiful landscape of this pristine spring. So when I look at it, I ask myself, is this beautiful spring what we lost or what we can get back, right? What is the relationship between that and that map? And the map of Maui over here is, to me, even more sort of devoid of human presence, even though the layer on top of it is actually a map of where people lived. So in this case, the overlay map is a map of a sugar plantation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that plantation context in a minute. But the fact that the plantation map is so much larger than that map of Hawaii feels to me like a commentary about the way that the land was valued. The focus is on the extraction of resources, and that story is overwriting that sort of topography of Hawaii. And another aspect that strikes me about both of these pieces is the way that indigenous people's presence is marked only by absence. In the blue hold piece, which is this one, there's a note on the map in the lower left corner, which you can look at after this, and it says Blue Hole, which is the name of the spring. Blue Hole, a spring that was the source of the San Antonio River. Native Americans who visited the water's early spring were last seen in 1954. So I see a piece about honoring the beauty of these natural spaces and acknowledgement of the fact that these spaces held importance for Native peoples, but no real attempt to consider their actual presence. It reads to me like a desire to return this space to a state of nature, which is the state most kind of historical works about indigenous peoples expect indigenous peoples to be. And so would a return of the wildness of this space lead to a return of indigenous peoples, right? Is this a comment on the fact that if this spring is returned, the land and people will come? But first and foremost, I want to stress that Native people haven't disappeared, right? They're still there. 1954 did not mark some particularly important moment in indigenous history. And I can't say for certain which indigenous people lived in this space before the arrival of Europeans, and any count of modern day indigenous peoples actually is going to be a count not necessarily of indigenous peoples native to that space. And this is one of the difficulties that we have when we talk about Native peoples, is we say, well, I looked it up, the census in 2010 said there are 300,000 people who identified as indigenous in Texas. But that doesn't mean they're indigenous to that land, right? And so even having a conversation about whose land it is enormously complicated. And there's a risk when we try to decolonize our language and spaces, we tend to want to freeze a moment in time when things were authentically indigenous. Even when we craft land acknowledgements, which I can talk about at great length if you want to hear me talk about this later, we risk selecting a moment, either before or after the arrival of Europeans, to represent indigenous lives, as if we choose 1500, this is when things were the way they're supposed to be. And that is a narrative we are creating. So where do we cut off that designation of who lived where and who gets what space? It's not to say that we should give up that project and not care, but it's just a caution against treating indigenous peoples as atavistic, as out of time. And equally importantly, as treating indigenous peoples as the same as the land, right, as part of the landscape. which I feel, to me, and when I see this image, that's what it says to me. So the tendency of Europeans to emphasize the oneness of natives and the land has led us to ignore the impact of thousands of years of indigenous presence on the land. 19th century travelers and historians used to write extensive treatises speculating that some lost European group or some tribe of Israel created historical sites like Cahokia or Chaco Canyon. They would craft elaborate fantasies about lost Irish monks who went and built things in different spaces because they didn't believe that the indigenous peoples they met could do that. So they went to these great lengths to assert the rightness of their conquest by creating an alternative history where white people shaped American land and built great cities and temples, which were then overrun by the more savage American Indians. And by erasing the indigenous impact on the land, we can more easily ignore the fact that they inhabited the land for more than 20,000 years before Europeans arrived. So this piece by Joy Josloff speaks to me in kind of similar tones. It's a topographical map of Maui that's overlaid with this map of what it says is Spanish A camp. So nowhere do we see the acknowledgement of indigenous Hawaiians or Hawaiian peoples or the lands they inhabited in this image. And again, it's to me, fundamentally an image about colonialism in which the horrors are the abuse of the land and the individuals incorporated and conscripted to toil in its fields. Plantation camps in Hawaii in the 19th and 20th centuries were multi-ethnic spaces with workers from typically the Philippines, Japan, China, Korea, and Puerto Rico. In this particular example, as it's labeled Spanish camp, it's not a camp made by the Spanish, it's an American camp housing Spanish-speaking people. Also Portuguese-speaking people, but we'll not worry about that for the sake. The vast majority of individuals who lived in this Spanish camp were from Puerto Rico. These plantation camps were crowded and filthy with limited facilities for education or medical care. The work of sugar production is brutal, dangerous, and hot. In addition to the standard risks of toiling in hot fields from dawn to dusk, sugarcane processing is enormously dangerous. Sugarcane stalks are really sharp, and so as you are cutting them down, you risk injury and infected wounds and all sorts of things. The cane is then taken and crushed by a kind of roller machine, which was quite common in the Caribbean and in Hawaii for loss of limb to be one of the more common injuries for those who were processing sugarcane. And then you take all that and you boil that pulp in a giant vat in a really hot building, right? And the workers in these camps, in this particular camp, were not enslaved. They were volunteers. We can recognize that there's a space between fully free and enslaved, right? They were essentially what we might think of as indentured. So were lured from their home countries by promises from corporations. They would come and they would send representatives to poor districts in China and say, hey, there's this great opportunity elsewhere. This should all sound fairly familiar if you're familiar with the history of American immigration, right? Lured away with these promises of great things. And so they would convince them to leave their struggling nation for a chance at a better life. And residents of these camps in the 19th and early 20th century were not eligible for citizenship, and they could not access the rights afforded to their white American bosses. The colonization of Hawaii is long and complex, and I'm just gonna give you like a 2-paragraph history of Hawaii in a second. It's long and complex with multiple waves of foreigners seeking the island's riches for their own. But in the case of sugar plantations, the majority of non-Hawaiians were not exploiting Hawaii for their own benefit, but for the benefit of their corporate masters. Hawaii was first discovered by Europeans in 1778 by Captain James Cook, who was also fairly famous for his discovery of New Zealand. His name graces the Cook Islands. Cook named the Hawaiian Islands the Sandwich Islands, which I think is fun, but it's not less fun when you learn it's just named for a man named John Montagu, who was the Earl of Sandwich. Whether or not Cook was the first European to set foot on Hawaiian soil is not that important or interesting to me, but Cook was killed by Hawaiians, and if you want to hear me talk about cannibalism, there's a lot of speculation there. One sentence, no, he was not eaten. But he was killed by Hawaiians, but only after he destroyed a bunch of sacred idols and burned them and took a local king hostage. And he expected that that king would be ransomed back by his people. Instead, his supporters killed Cook, took their king back, and then Cook's crew was forced to flee without their captain. But the fact that we actually mark the discovery as the first European to set foot on this land, I think is really telling about the process of colonialism. We don't mark the first person from Africa, the first person from Asia or Australia. We mark the first European as if that's the moment that the story starts to matter. The story is told from the perspective of European men. The antagonists are the land and its peoples. So after Cook leaves, things are thrown into chaos, right? Europeans bring diseases and all sorts of other problems, rats, right? There's a lot of fascinating history, the natural history of the Pacific, in which many of these spaces did not have those kinds of predators until European ships brought them. So after this, the Hawaiian Islands actually unite under a central monarchy. So prior to this, they were separate, smaller kingdoms, and under this Kamehameha dynasty, named for the first king, this dynasty ruled Hawaii from 1795 to 1872, and they welcomed missionaries and traders from Europe in fairly large numbers. The missionaries slowly divested the people of their traditional kapu social and religious structure, and they began the slow ruination of Hawaiian traditions and the leeching of power from the monarchy. European diseases continued to affect Hawaiians and led to a crisis of succession in 1874, which troops from the US and the UK were happy to help them solve. The new puppet king was forced to sign a new constitution written by white traders, which stripped him of his power and disenfranchised most indigenous Hawaiians. White landowners could now vote in the assembly, but not indigenous Hawaiians. After his death, that last king, the final queen of Hawaii, her name is Liliuokalani, wanted to write a new constitution that would take back some of the things that her predecessor had signed away. Well, as you might imagine, that wasn't super popular with the predominantly sugar plantation owning elite, including people whose names you might recognize, like Sanford Dole. So Sanford Dole and others formed a group they called the Committee of Safety. That's an ironic name. And they staged a coup d'etat in 1893, deposing Liliuokalani, who was, for all that we understand, she was not and she was not trying to kick out every European person. Her husband was in fact European, but because she wanted to return some of that power to the indigenous peoples, that was enough. So over the next few years, all of those various people who assumed they were stakeholders, right, there was violence and a lot of unrest. So once that happened, people like Sanford Dole came to the US and were like, hey, we toppled this empire, can we have Hawaii now? And surprisingly, Grover Cleveland said no. He said, this was inappropriate, you toppled an existing monarchy, that's not okay, and he issued an apology. But in 1898, President McKinley changed course and we annexed the territory. In the newly created territory of Hawaii, immigrants arrived from across the globe to work in these plantation fields. So in this particular camp, most of the residents were people who had fled Puerto Rico in 1899 after a devastating hurricane. I'll look at this, maybe, what has happened will happen again. So they left the sugar production in Puerto Rico, which was devastated by this hurricane, and moved to Hawaii for work. And incidentally, Puerto Rico became a US territory in the same year as Hawaii in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. So to return to the image itself, you have multiple layers of the story of colonialism in Hawaii. The map itself represents the colonization and conquest of Hawaii, and the Spanish camp with its Puerto Rican population brings in the context of colonization in the rest of the world, right? That this is all part of a larger system. To understand the story of Hawaii and how it fits in the story of this camp, it is a multi-ethnic geographic story that expands well past just this island, which again to me is part of why I see the map of the plantation camp as larger than that map of Hawaii itself. But colonialism and feminism have always been intertwined. Conquerors decry the gendered and sexual practices of the people that they wish to conquer, calling them promiscuous, cannibals, and sodomites. They insist that their mission was a righteous one, as they must teach these ignorant savages about the right religion, the right way to build homes, the power of monogamy and marriage, and the dangers of homosexuality. Colonialism across the world made the lives of women in conquered nations worse. In many North American indigenous societies, women held greater power and influence over community affairs, with some tribes supporting far greater gender and sexual equity and fluidity than we see today. As indigenous power structures were toppled and their societies were in free fall, Western patriarchy swoops in to teach women and other minoritized groups about their place in the world. Women's art and spiritual leadership are reduced to craft and subservience to men. The women artists collected in this Femfolio demonstrate the continued resistance to colonization of their minds, bodies, and work. And I would be remiss if I did not reflect on the fact that many of the artists represented here are not women of color or individuals with direct experience of colonization. But the first step towards the liberation of all peoples is for us to find our voices and to use them. That's all I got.
Wonderful. So we are going to do a Q&A. Bob was hoping that we would be liberated from the repeating of questions since we're not live streaming. But because we are going to make a digital copy of this available online, I will repeat any questions into the microphone so that the digital audience can hear them, and then step aside so that Kelly has a chance to answer them. Or if you'd like to come up to the microphone yourself, you make my job easier.
Or if you want to answer them, feel free.
All right. Does anyone have any questions for Kelly? Yes, Bob.
I'm going to make this long and drawn-out questions.
So you can come up to the microphone, please, Bob.
I always like to ask the speaker, and you did explain a little bit about why you selected these, but when you look around in the rest of the work in this gallery, these two spoke to you about colonialism, a topic that you're very familiar with. Were there other pieces in here that also maybe you felt could fit in there, or maybe another area of interest to you as well?
So our curator, Robert Bridges, always one to try and get people's opinions about the art that he so beautifully hangs on our walls, would like to know about Dr. Watson's process of choosing the works of art that she wanted to focus on, and also if there were any other works of art in the exhibition that she felt would fall into the themes of her expertise or that drew her in kind of intellectually and conceptually.
So I had long conversations with Jason here about why I chose these two, because his comment was like, these are not the two I would have chosen, right? These are just not what spoke to me. And I think part of it is, right, as a historian, the ones that I'm like, here's history, I see it, it's very clear. And to me, I see them as straightforward. And I was told that that maybe not be the case for everybody else, but to me, I read this and, okay, yeah, this makes sense to me, and I can clearly articulate that. There were a couple of others that I thought about. Talking about one is the one right behind Heather here, which to me invokes, right, a lot of Latin American traditions about Day of the Dead, and part of that continuation of indigenous cultures and representations. And the maple piece that's over there, but I didn't think anyone wanted to hear me talk about, because it's a maple and it has sort of tethers with heads on the bottom. I didn't know that anyone really wanted to hear me talk about like torture for a long time, even though I could. I just wasn't sure that that's what you wanted from me. Right, so, yeah. And the piece with the skeletons, the sort of reference of the dance macabre, the sort of medieval tradition of sort of representing discomfort and unease in transitioning to a new space and a new kind of culture. But as I think I mentioned, I think walking around, I see the feminism and I see the feminist art here, but I don't think it actually speaks as loudly as I might have expected. And that's not a good or bad thing, it's the way it is. And I think it's really sort of fascinating to me, the way that all of these pieces collectively tell you a story about a moment in feminist history and in feminist art history. But if you saw this image devoid of context, right, it wouldn't necessarily scream, this is a feminist artist to me. And so I could have talked a lot more about those kinds of things. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, great.
Any other questions?
If you want to hear about torture.
so like, I don't necessarily think of Hawaii as starting when Cook founded it, right? But so, do you feel like we're making gains in that venture as academics, as educators, or are we still failing at kind of these longer histories of Polynesian kind of cultural groups, or, does that make sense?
So Megan is making my job difficult. Megan, who is an art historian of the ancient world, was kind of coming from that same perspective of looking at long histories and wanting to know if we collectively, as an intellectual community, as a society, are doing a better job than maybe we once were of being able to look at places over the longue durée and not marking them at a point in history, especially one defined by contact with European culture.
Yes. No, I mean, no, I will obviously give a longer answer than that. But I do think that we are sort of making strides. But I think there's a long way to go. So one of the kind of projects I sometimes do with my students that I think speaks to this is I taught history for a long time, so it's going to be about history textbooks. But when you look at history textbooks, there's always like one chapter that's like before Europe. And it's just one out of like 16 chapters. And so we do this exercise where we try to write European history in the way that Indigenous history is written. And so there's a sample that I give them. It's like 2 paragraphs of, then they discovered a sky god, and they worshipped him by drinking cups of liquid that represented his body, and sort of telling the story in a way that realizes just sort of how disconnected from the meanings of Indigenous societies we are. And so I think we're getting there, but I don't know that historians have a great way of talking about history that doesn't involve documents and dates and times and timelines. And so I think we struggle to talk about the long durée that isn't like, and then agriculture developed, and they had settled towns, right? To tell a story about a people whose story is not one of progress, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, we define progress as like building bigger towns and bigger buildings and bigger cities. But that isn't necessarily what makes a community thrive, what makes it last for a long time. And so I think if we speak about often history in a teleological way, which sort of assumes the end, right? Like we know how it ends, and so we tell the story to get us to where we are. I think that makes it more difficult for us to really include those kinds of stories. So that's a rather long-winded answer. Does that make sense?
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelly. I appreciate you acknowledging the anxiety of the assignment, and I also think you perfectly understood the assignment, and that I really hope that these talks are an opportunity for people to view the works of art in our exhibitions and collections through a different lens. And I think that certainly for me, and I hope for the rest of our audience, we were able to do that here today. So one more thank you for Kelly. Our Lunchtime Looks program will continue next month with our program coordinator, Madeline Brody, who is going to be talking about some objects in the Diversaana Male exhibition, which is in the front of this gallery. It similarly will be an in-person event with a recording posted later to our YouTube playlist, and that's on November 4th. We are also going to be having a Family and Community Day on Saturday, November 5th, that is going to be planned by my students, like Seth. He's going to find out all about that on Monday. So we hope that you can join us for these couple of public events for the rest of the season, and we wish you a good afternoon and a beautiful fall weekend. Thank you for being here.
And feel free to contact me if you have questions or just want to hear more about weird stuff. So have a lovely day. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.